Picture yourself drifting back through time, floating like a gentle leaf on a quiet river. Long ago, before the world became loud and bright, there was a flower, a simple flower with soft petals that held a secret inside. This secret could stop pain. It could bring sleep. It could make dreams feel as real as waking life. But this same flower would also start wars, topple emperors, and change the shape of entire nations. Tonight, let yourself relax as we follow the story of one small plant that became more powerful than any army. Breathe slowly. Close your eyes if you wish. Let the hidden force of history wash over you like warm water. We will walk together through misty fields, across calm seas, and into the quiet rooms where empires made their darkest choices. The story begins in ancient soil, where farmers first noticed something strange growing in their gardens. The first people to discover the sleeping poppy lived in lands we now call the Middle East. They tilled the earth under hot sun, planting wheat and barley to feed their families. One season, a different plant appeared among the grain. It had a straight green stem and a bulb at the top, shaped like a tiny urn. When the petals fell away, this bulb wept white tears if you scratched its skin. The farmers tasted this milk and felt their pain melt away like snow in spring. They did not understand chemistry or medicine. They only knew that the white sap made tired bodies rest and troubled minds grow quiet. They called it the joy plant, the gift plant, the plant of forgetting. Old people with aching bones slept peacefully after taking a little. Warriors wounded in battle closed their eyes without crying out. Mothers gave tiny drops to sick children whose fevers would not break. The poppy grew well in that warm climate. Its seeds were smaller than grains of sand, but each plant made thousands of them. When the pods dried and split open, the wind carried seeds to new fields. Soon the flower spread across Mesopotamia, blooming in places where no one had planted it. The white tears became so common that people stopped seeing them as magical. They became ordinary, like bread or water. But some people paid closer attention. They were the healers, the wise ones who studied plants and stars. These healers learned exactly how much poppy milk would ease pain without bringing harm. They mixed it with wine or honey to hide the bitter taste. They dried the sap into dark, sticky balls that could be stored for many months. They traded these balls to travelers heading toward distant mountains and seas. This knowledge passed from teacher to student, generation after generation. The poppy and its gift moved quietly through time, helping humanity bear its suffering. No one imagined that this gentle medicine would one day become a weapon. No one dreamed that nations would go to war to control its trade. The flower simply grew, bloomed, and wept its milky tears under the ancient sun, waiting for the world to change around it. As centuries passed, the sleeping flower found new homes in new empires. Persian gardens cultivated poppies alongside roses and jasmine. Egyptian priests used the milky sap in their temple rituals, believing it opened doors to the realm of dreams. Greek physicians, including the famous Hippocrates, wrote about its power to soothe and calm. They called it opium, meaning juice, and this word would eventually become opium. The ancient world moved slowly then. Knowledge traveled at the speed of walking feet or sailing ships. When a Persian trader brought opium to a Greek island, it might take years before anyone in Egypt heard about it. When a Roman soldier carried some back from a distant province. His neighbors learned of it through whispered stories, not written books. The flower's reputation grew, the way a stream becomes a river, gradually, naturally, without anyone directing its course. In Rome, wealthy citizens used opium to help them sleep after long banquets. Poets took small amounts, claiming it made their verses flow like honey. Gladiators chewed it before entering the arena to dull the fear of death. The substance became woven into daily life, so common that people forgot to wonder about its origin. They simply knew it worked, and that was enough. But empires rise and fall like tides. Rome crumbled, Persia transformed. New kingdoms emerged from the dust of old ones. Through all these changes, the poppy continued its quiet work. Fields of white and purple blooms swayed in Mediterranean breezes. Farmers harvested the precious sap each summer when the petals dropped and the bulbs grew fat. They scored the pods with special knives at sunset, then returned at dawn to scrape away the dried tears that had oozed out overnight. This was careful work that required patience and skill. Too deep a cut and the sap would flow into the ground, wasted. Too shallow and barely any would emerge. The best farmers could look at a poppy field and know exactly when each pod was ready for harvest. They passed this knowledge to their children, who passed it to theirs, creating families that served the sleeping flower for generations. These garden empires dreamed peacefully under starlit skies, never knowing that far to the east, another civilization was beginning its own complicated relationship with the poppy. Ships were being built, trade routes were being mapped. The age of quiet gardens was ending, and the age of vast commerce was about to begin. The flower that had once been a local gift was about to become a global commodity. Long caravans of camels moved across empty deserts, their bells ringing softly in the night. These were the Silk Roads, ancient highways that connected the Mediterranean world to the mysterious lands of the Far East. Merchants traveled for months, sometimes years, carrying goods from one civilization to another. They brought Chinese silk westward and Roman gold eastward. They traded spices, gems, pottery, and textbooks. And hidden among these treasures, wrapped carefully in cloth, were dark balls of dried opium. The traders knew this cargo was valuable. A small amount could be sold for a good price in any city along the route. Sick people needed it. Wealthy people wanted it. Healers requested it for their stores. The caravans stopped at oasis towns where palm trees grew around precious wells. While the camels drank and rested, the merchants would conduct quiet business in shaded courtyards. A ball of opium might be exchanged for a bolt of silk or a handful of silver coins. These roads were dangerous. Sandstorms could bury an entire caravan beneath dunes. Bandits hid in rocky passes, waiting to attack. Winter snows blocked mountain paths. Many traders died far from home, their bones bleaching white under foreign suns. But the profits were too tempting to resist. If a merchant survived the journey, his family would be wealthy for generations. The opium traveled in small quantities then, just one product among many. No one thought of it as particularly important. It could not be worn like silk or shaped into tools like metal. It simply was what it was, a medicine, a luxury, a comfort for those who could afford it. The poppy seeds traveled too, scattered by wind or carried deliberately by curious farmers who wanted to try growing the valuable plant in their own soil. Slowly, carefully, the poppy made its way eastward. It crossed Persia and touched the borders of India. It climbed mountain paths into Central Asia. It followed rivers into China's western provinces. Each place it reached, people recognized its power. They had their own names for it, their own ways of preparing and using it. But the essential nature of the plant remained the same everywhere, a gift that could heal or harm depending on how it was used. The moonlit caravans continued their endless journeys. One merchant's cargo became another merchant's inventory, which became a third merchant's sale. The opium passed through countless hands, each person taking a small profit before sending it further along. No one thought about where this trade might lead. No one imagined empires would someday battle over the right to sell this substance. They simply conducted their business under stars that had watched humanity trade for thousands of years. In ancient China, physicians studied the natural world with deep attention. They believed that every plant, every animal, every stone held specific properties that could help or harm the human body. They tasted herbs to learn their effects. They watched how different substances interacted when mixed together. They recorded their findings in books that were copied and passed down through generations of students. When opium first arrived in China, these healers examined it carefully. They noticed it made people sleepy and calm. They observed that it stopped coughing and eased pain in the belly. They discovered that mixing it with other herbs could create powerful medicines for many ailments. They began including opium in their remedies, always in small, measured amounts. The physicians were careful. They knew that too much of anything could turn from cure to poison. They warned their patients to use opium sparingly, only when truly needed. They explained that the body could become dependent on it if used too often. This wisdom was written into medical texts with careful brushstrokes. The character for opium showed a plant bringing sleep, a neutral symbol, neither good nor evil. For centuries, this balanced approach worked. Opium remained a medicine in China, just as it had been in Persia and Greece. When someone broke a bone, a physician might give them a small dose to help them rest while healing. When an old person could not sleep through the night because of pain, a tiny amount mixed with tea might bring relief. The substance served humanity without controlling it. Chinese doctors also used opium to treat a condition they called persistent loose bowels, what we might call severe diarrhea today. This illness killed many people, especially children, by draining the body of water. Opium had the power to stop this dangerous symptom quickly. Many lives were saved by the careful application of this medicine. The healers who dispensed it were respected members of their communities, trusted to know the difference between helping and harming. The opium used in Chinese medicine came from their own fields at first. Farmers in certain provinces grew small patches of poppies just as they grew other medicinal plants. The harvest was modest, enough to supply local physicians, but nothing more. The flowers bloomed quietly in spring gardens, beautiful and useful, watched over by people who understood both their power and their danger. No one yet realized that foreign ships were coming, carrying cargo that would overwhelm all this ancient wisdom with a flood of addiction. The year was 1600, and Portuguese ships began arriving in Chinese ports. These tall vessels had crossed vast oceans, navigating by stars and primitive maps. Their holds were filled with goods from Europe and India: wool cloth, glassware, wine, and among these items, balls of Indian opium wrapped in oil paper. The Portuguese sailors had learned that Chinese merchants would pay well for this cargo. The trade started small and quiet. A ship might carry a few chests of opium alongside larger shipments of other products. Chinese buyers purchased these modest amounts to supply physicians and apothecaries. Everything seemed orderly and controlled. The Portuguese captains noted the demand and began bringing slightly more opium on each voyage. The transaction was simple. Foreign merchants sold, Chinese merchants bought, and both sides profited fairly. But the sea routes were changing the world. What once took years by caravan now took months by ship. What could only be transported in small camel loads could now fill an entire ship's hold. The same amount of opium that might have traveled the Silk Roads over 5 years could now cross the ocean in a single voyage. Scale began to change everything. Other European nations noticed the profitable Portuguese trade. Dutch ships started appearing in Asian waters, then English ships. Each nation wanted a share of the wealth that Asia offered. They established trading posts on small islands and in port cities where local rulers allowed them to conduct business. These tiny footholds would eventually grow into something much larger and more troubling. The ships themselves were marvels of technology. Their sails caught winds that pushed them across distances that would have seemed impossible to earlier generations. Their hulls were strong enough to survive terrible storms. Their captains kept detailed logs and charts, gradually mapping every coastline and current. The age of global trade was beginning, and opium was becoming one of many commodities that connected distant continents. Chinese officials watched these foreign ships with mixed feelings. The trade brought silver into their empire, which was useful, but it also brought strange people with strange customs who did not always show proper respect for Chinese ways. Some officials suggested limiting foreign contact to certain ports and certain times of year. Others argued that trade enriched everyone and should be encouraged. These debates happened in capital cities, far from the docks where the actual business occurred. The quiet cargo of dreams continued arriving on every tide, waiting in dark warehouses for buyers who did not yet understand what they were truly purchasing. The British East India Company was not like modern corporations. It was more like a small kingdom that happened to be owned by private investors rather than a royal family. The company had its own army, its own ships, its own territories, and its own rules. The British government had given it the right to conduct trade and even wage war in Asia. This arrangement seems strange today, but in the 1700s it was considered normal and efficient. The company looked at the world as a collection of resources to be acquired and profits to be maximized. When company directors studied their trading records, they noticed something interesting. The Chinese had many products Europeans wanted, silk and porcelain, but China wanted very little from Europe in return. This meant European traders had to pay for Chinese goods with silver, which drained precious metal from Western treasuries. The company needed something China would buy in large quantities. They considered many options. Could they sell European wool? No, Chinese silk was superior. Could they sell glass? No, Chinese porcelain was more beautiful. Could they sell wheat? No, Chinese farms produced enough food. The company directors puzzled over this problem for years, watching silver flow eastward with nothing flowing back. Then someone noticed that Indian opium sold well in China, not just to physicians for medicine, but increasingly to ordinary people who had begun using it for pleasure. The company directors saw their solution. India was already under British East India Company control. The climate there was perfect for growing poppies. If they could increase production dramatically, they could create a product that would balance the trade with China and recover all that lost silver. The decision was made in comfortable offices in London, far from the fields where the poppies would grow, and far from the cities where the opium would be consumed. The directors did not think of themselves as doing anything wrong. They were simply conducting business, finding a product one customer wanted, and arranging for another customer to supply it. They wrote their instructions in neat handwriting, sealed the documents with wax, and sent them on ships to India. Company officials in India received these orders and began implementing them. They approached Indian farmers with new requirements. Instead of growing food for their families, farmers were now required to grow poppies for the company. The company would provide the seeds, dictate the planting schedule, and purchase the entire harvest at fixed prices. The farmers had no choice in the matter. The land was controlled by the company, and the company's wishes became law. The transformation of Indian agriculture from feeding people to feeding addiction was beginning, one field at a time. The monsoon rains arrived in India as they had for millions of years, dark clouds rolling in from the ocean to drench the land. These rains made the soil rich and fertile. Anything planted in this earth seemed to grow with extraordinary vigor. The British East India Company officials understood this. They chose regions in Bengal and Bihar, areas with the best combination of rainfall, sunshine, and temperature. These would become the new opium fields. Indian farmers received their instructions and their seeds. Each tiny poppy seed was smaller than a grain of sand, black or brown or gray, depending on the variety. The farmers scattered these seeds across prepared soil just after the monsoon rains ended. The seeds needed moisture to germinate, but sunshine to grow. Timing was everything. Plant too early and the seeds would rot. Plant too late and the cold season would arrive before harvest. As the plants grew, they required constant care. Farmers had to water them when rain did not come. They had to pull weeds that competed for nutrients. They had to watch for insects and diseases that could destroy an entire field overnight. The poppies themselves were delicate things, their stems thin and breakable, their roots shallow. A strong wind could flatten them. A sudden frost could kill them. The farmers worked from dawn until after sunset, treating the poppies more carefully than they had ever treated their food crops. When the flowers bloomed, the fields became seas of color: white, pink, purple, and red poppies nodding in gentle breezes. For a few days, the fields were beautiful, like something from a peaceful dream. Then the petals fell, revealing the seed pods that contained the valuable sap. Now came the harvest, the most demanding work of all. Each pod had to be scored with a special three-bladed knife. The farmers walked through the fields at sunset, making shallow, vertical cuts on each bulb. The milky sap would ooze out overnight. At dawn, before the sun grew hot, the farmers returned with dull scraping tools. They carefully collected the sap, which had dried into a sticky brown paste. This paste was scraped into clay pots, which were taken to collection centers. The company officials weighed each pot and recorded the amount. They paid the farmers fixed prices that barely covered the cost of production. The farmers had no ability to negotiate. They could not sell their opium to anyone else. They could not choose to grow something else instead. The entire system was designed to produce maximum opium at minimum cost. The golden fields of India turned into fields of golden profit for the British East India Company, while the farmers themselves remained poor, watching their hard work disappear into ships bound for China. In the Chinese port cities of Canton, Macau, and later Shanghai, something new was happening. Foreign merchants were not just selling opium to physicians anymore. They were selling it to anyone who had money. Shops appeared where people could purchase small amounts without any medical reason. Some entrepreneurial Chinese businessmen opened special houses where customers could smoke opium in comfortable rooms with cushions and dim lights. At first, only wealthy people could afford this new habit. Opium was expensive, and the practice of smoking it required special equipment: a pipe, a lamp, and needles to prepare the drug properly. Rich merchants might gather in opium houses after conducting their business, relaxing together the way Europeans might gather in a tavern. They believed they were simply enjoying a sophisticated pleasure, like appreciating fine tea or good wine. The foreign merchants watched this development with satisfaction. Demand was growing. Each year, more ships arrived carrying more chests of opium. Each year, more Chinese customers were willing to pay for the product. The trade that had started with a few hundred chests per year was now reaching thousands of chests annually. Each chest contained enough opium to supply many people for many months. But something darker was beginning to emerge from the smoke-filled rooms. Some customers found they could not stop using opium even when they wanted to. Their bodies had adapted to the drug and now required it to feel normal. Without it, the only way to make these symptoms stop was to smoke more opiums. They were trapped. These addicted people were not weak or foolish. Opium addiction is a physical condition, not a moral failing. The drug changes the brain in ways that create dependence. Once this process begins, willpower alone usually cannot break it. The addicted people in China began spending all their money on opium. When the money ran out, they sold their possessions. When the possessions were gone, they borrowed from family members. When no one would lend anymore, they sometimes stole or begged. Chinese society began noticing the damage. Families were being destroyed. Workers were becoming unreliable. Soldiers were losing their discipline. Silver was flowing out of China to pay for the drug, reversing the old pattern and now draining China's treasury instead of Europe's. The whispers of concern were growing louder in every city where the smoke drifted through the air. Officials in Beijing, far from the ports, were receiving reports that something terrible was happening to their people. The gift that had once healed pain was now creating a pain that could not be healed. The Qing Dynasty ruled China from the Forbidden City in Beijing, a vast palace complex where the emperor and his court lived in splendor. By the early 1800s, the Qing emperors had governed China for nearly 2 centuries. They considered their civilization the most refined and advanced in the world. The Chinese word for China, Zhongguo, meant Middle Kingdom, the center of everything important. Foreign nations were viewed as tributary states that should show respect and follow Chinese rules when conducting business. But reports kept arriving at the palace. Officials from the coastal provinces wrote alarming letters describing the opium problem. They reported that addiction was spreading from the wealthy to the poor, that government officials themselves were becoming addicted, that the outflow of silver to pay for opium was threatening the economy. The emperor read these reports with growing concern. The emperor issued an edict. Opium smoking was forbidden. Anyone caught using it would be punished. Anyone caught selling it would be punished more severely. This was not the first such decree. Earlier emperors had tried similar bans, but this time the emperor was serious about enforcement. He appointed a special commissioner, a stern official named Lin Zexu, to go to Canton and end the opium trade completely. Lin Zexu was a man of principle and courage. He arrived in Canton in 1839 and immediately began his work. He ordered all Chinese opium dealers arrested. He demanded that foreign merchants surrender all the opium in their warehouses. When the foreign merchants hesitated, Lin took a bold step. He essentially imprisoned them in their own trading compound, refusing to let them leave until they handed over the drug. The standoff lasted for weeks. The foreign merchants, led by representatives of the British East India Company, eventually surrendered more than 20,000 chests of opium. This was an enormous quantity, worth millions of pounds in British currency. Lin Zexu had the chests brought to the beach. Workers dug huge trenches, broke open the chests, and mixed the opium with salt and lime to destroy it. The mixture was washed out to sea with the tide. The destruction took weeks to complete. Lin Zexu thought he had solved the problem. He had demonstrated China's determination. He had shown that the emperor's laws would be enforced. He wrote a letter to Queen Victoria of Britain, respectfully but firmly explaining that China would no longer tolerate the opium trade. He believed that reasonable people, even foreign ones, would understand and respect China's right to protect its people. He did not realize that he had just triggered a war. The British government viewed the destruction of the opium not as legitimate law enforcement, but as an attack on British property and dignity. Ships were being loaded with soldiers and cannons. The age of peaceful misunderstanding was ending, and the age of violent conflict was about to begin. Before Lin Zexu destroyed the opium, the British East India Company had been making enormous profits from the China trade. The company had shareholders in London who expected regular dividends. British merchants in Asia had built their businesses around the opium trade. British ships had routes and schedules designed to carry the drug efficiently. When Lin Zexu destroyed 20,000 chests, he destroyed millions of pounds of value in a single action. The merchants sent urgent messages back to London. They demanded the British government protect their interests and punish China for the destruction of British property. They argued that free trade was a sacred principle and that no nation had the right to tell British merchants what they could or could not sell. They painted the situation as an attack on British dignity and power, not as a legitimate response to an illegal drug trade. The British government faced a choice. They could accept China's decision to ban opium and find other products to trade, or they could use military force to reopen the market. After debate in Parliament, they chose force. The decision was justified using the language of free trade and national honor, carefully avoiding too much discussion about what exactly was being traded. British warships were ordered to China to compel the Qing government to change its policies. The ships that arrived off the Chinese coast in 1840 were like nothing China had seen before. They were powered not just by wind but by steam engines. They had iron hulls that Chinese cannons could barely damage. They carried modern artillery that could fire from distances beyond Chinese weapons range. The technological gap between Britain and China had grown wider than anyone in Beijing understood. The war itself was shockingly one-sided. British ships sailed up Chinese rivers, attacking forts and cities almost at will. Chinese forces were brave but hopelessly outmatched. Their wooden war junks splintered under British naval guns. Their shore batteries were silenced by accurate long-range fire. Their soldiers, still using matchlock muskets and even bows, faced British troops with modern rifles and disciplined formations. The The battles were brief and decisive, each one demonstrating British superiority. The Qing government was stunned. They had thought of themselves as the world's greatest civilization, with foreign nations as barbarians who should feel grateful to trade with China at all. Now these barbarians were defeating Chinese forces easily, sailing wherever they wished, and dictating terms. The emperor and his officials struggled to understand how this had happened. They had closed their eyes to the world's changes while that world had transformed around them. Now they were paying the price in blood and humiliation, all because they had tried to protect their people from a drug that foreign merchants insisted on selling. The war ended in 1842 with a treaty signed on a British warship anchored in the Yangtze River. Chinese negotiators came aboard to accept Britain's terms. They had no real choice. British forces controlled key coastal areas and could strike anywhere they wished. The treaty was not a negotiation between equals, but a document of surrender that China was forced to accept. The Treaty of Nanking, as it became known, included several devastating provisions for China. First, China had to pay Britain a huge sum of silver to compensate for the destroyed opium and the cost of the war. This was money China could not afford, and it would drain the treasury for years. Second, China had to open 5 ports to British trade instead of just Canton. British merchants could now establish businesses in multiple cities. Third, and most humiliatingly, China had to give the island of Hong Kong to Britain permanently. Hong Kong was a small, rocky island with a good harbor, relatively unimportant to China at the time. But it would become a British colony that would remain under British control for over 150 years. Fourth, China had to accept fixed tariffs on British goods. China could no longer control taxes on imports, which meant losing sovereignty over its own trade policy. The treaty did not explicitly legalize opium. British negotiators knew that would be too obviously shameful, but it ensured that British merchants could operate much more freely in China, which meant opium smuggling would be easier. Chinese officials would find it nearly impossible to enforce any ban. The treaty protected British commercial interests without directly mentioning the product that had caused the entire conflict. China signed these terms with anger and shame. The officials who negotiated the treaty knew they were accepting something deeply unfair, but they also knew that refusing would mean more war, more defeats, and possibly worse terms later. They signed the documents and returned to Beijing to face the emperor's disappointment. The news spread across China, creating a mixture of rage and despair among people who had always believed their civilization was superior. The Treaty of Nanking became the first of what Chinese historians would later call the unequal treaties. Other Western powers, seeing Britain's success, would soon demand similar concessions. France, Germany, Russia, and eventually Japan would carve out their own spheres of influence in China. The Qing Dynasty's authority would crumble bit by bit, and through it all, opium would continue flowing into China in ever greater quantities. The smoke from the opium pipes would hang over Chinese cities like fog, symbol of a nation wounded and vulnerable, forced to accept poison because it had lost the power to refuse. After the Treaty of Nanking, the opium trade did not decrease, it exploded. The treaty's provisions made it easier for British and other foreign merchants to operate in China. Even though opium was still technically illegal under Chinese law, enforcement became nearly impossible. Foreign merchants operated from the safety of treaty ports, where Chinese officials had limited authority. They employed Chinese distributors who took the actual risk of moving the drug inland. The amount of opium entering China grew dramatically. Before the war, imports had been measured in thousands of chests per year. After the war, they climbed to tens of thousands of chests annually. Each chest contained about 60 kilograms of opium, enough to supply hundreds of addicted users for months. Millions more Chinese people fell into addiction during the 2 decades following the First War. The pattern of addiction spread through society like water seeping into soil. It began in coastal cities, where the drug first arrived. Wealthy merchants and officials who could afford the expensive habit became addicted first. Then the practice spread to middle-class shopkeepers and craftsmen. Eventually, it reached poor laborers and farmers who spent money they desperately needed for food on opium instead. Opium houses appeared in every city and many towns. These establishments ranged from luxurious parlors with silk, cushions, and beautiful furniture to filthy rooms where dozens of people lay side by side on wooden platforms, smoking pipe after pipe in silence. The smell of opium smoke, sweet and acrid at the same time, became a common feature of Chinese urban life. People walked past opium houses the way they walked past tea shops or noodle stands, just another part of the landscape. Families were destroyed. A man might begin smoking opium socially, enjoying the relaxed feeling it provided after a hard day's work. Within months, he would be smoking daily. Within a year, he might be smoking several times a day, unable to work, selling family possessions to buy more drug. His wife might beg him to stop. His children might go hungry, but the addiction was stronger than family love, stronger than shame, stronger than reason. The economic impact on China was severe. Silver continued flowing out of the country to pay for opium. This meant less money for everything else, less for building roads, less for maintaining irrigation systems, less for supporting the army, less for paying government officials. At the same time, productivity decreased because so many workers were addicted. Fields went unplanted because farmers were too drugged to work. Shops closed because merchants spent their days in opium houses. The Qing Dynasty was being hollowed out from within, weakened by a poison that came from outside but was now spreading through every level of society like an incurable disease. In 1856, only 14 years after the First War, conflict erupted again. The immediate cause was a small incident involving a Chinese-owned ship called the Arrow that had been registered in Hong Kong. Chinese officials boarded the ship and arrested its crew on suspicion of piracy and smuggling. The British consul in Canton claimed this violated British rights because the ship was registered in a British territory. He demanded an apology and the release of the crew. The Chinese officials refused, arguing they had every right to arrest Chinese criminals on a Chinese-owned ship. The British viewed this as another example of Chinese disrespect for treaty obligations. Tensions escalated quickly. The British consul called for naval support. British warships began bombarding Canton's forts. The Chinese governor ordered his forces to resist. Within weeks, small incidents had grown into a full military conflict. This second war was even more one-sided than the first. China's military had not modernized significantly in the 14 years since the previous defeat. British forces had only become more advanced. This time, Britain was joined by France, which used the execution of a French missionary in southern China as justification to join the attack. Together, the British and French forces overwhelmed Chinese defenses. The Allied forces did not just fight on the coast this time. They pushed inland, capturing cities and forcing their way toward Beijing itself. The Qing court was terrified. No foreign army had threatened the capital in this way for centuries. The emperor and his officials had never imagined that the barbarians could march so deep into the heart of China. They prepared to flee, if necessary, packing valuable documents and treasures. The war dragged on from 1856 to 1860. Fighting was intermittent, with periods of combat followed by pauses for negotiations. The Qing government tried to delay and negotiate while building up forces. The British and French used each negotiating session to present new demands. When China refused or dragged its feet, military operations resumed. The pattern repeated: Chinese resistance, decisive foreign victory, temporary peace, renewed demands, renewed fighting. Nobody in China wanted this war. The Qing government had learned its lesson from the first conflict and had no desire for another defeat. But they also could not accept all British and French demands without losing all remaining dignity. Chinese forces knew they were outmatched, but fought anyway out of duty and pride. Ordinary Chinese people suffered as armies marched back and forth across the countryside, destroying crops and burning villages. The Arrow incident had been trivial, but the pride and commercial interests it triggered led to years of death and destruction that neither side had initially intended or wanted. In October 1860, British and French forces reached the outskirts of Beijing. The Shanfeng Emperor had already fled north to a mountain retreat, leaving his capital in the hands of his officials and guards. The foreign forces found Beijing's defenses outdated and weak. They encountered little real resistance. Within days, they controlled the area around the city, including the emperor's magnificent summer palace complex called Yuan Mingyuan. Yuan Mingyuan was one of the wonders of Asia. Built over more than a century, it covered almost 1,000 acres. The grounds contained hundreds of buildings, palaces, temples, pavilions, libraries, and theaters. Gardens had been designed with exquisite care, featuring artificial hills, meandering streams, and carefully placed rocks and trees. The complex held treasures accumulated over generations and ancient paintings, rare books, jade carvings, bronze vessels, silk tapestries, and countless other precious objects. British and French soldiers entered this paradise and began looting. They took whatever they could: carriagewry, porcelain, artwork, furniture. They dressed in imperial robes and mocked Chinese culture. They destroyed what they could not carry. The looting continued for days, with officers and common soldiers alike filling their pockets and bags with Chinese treasures. Many of these stolen objects ended up in European museums and private collections, where some remain today. Then came the order to burn everything. The British commander, Lord Elgin, decided that destroying the palace would teach China a lesson about respecting British demands. He specifically chose the palace rather than civilian targets in Beijing as a symbol of the Qing Dynasty's humiliation. On October 18, 1860, soldiers set fire to the wooden buildings. The flames spread quickly, consuming centuries of art and architecture in hours. The fires burned for 3 days. Smoke hung over the area like a funeral pall. When the flames finally died, almost nothing remained. Buildings that had stood for hundreds of years were reduced to blackened stones and ash. Gardens that had taken decades to perfect were scorched and trampled. The ruins of Yuan Mingyuan would remain as a scar on the landscape and on Chinese memory. Chinese officials who witnessed the destruction wept openly. To them, this was not just the loss of beautiful buildings, but the violation of their civilization's heart. The palace had represented everything refined and precious in Chinese culture. Its destruction symbolized China's powerlessness against foreign aggression. News of the burning spread across China, creating a mixture of shame, anger, and despair. The emperor, hearing the news in his northern retreat, purportedly became physically ill. The foreign barbarians had proven they could strike anywhere, destroy anything, and China could not stop them. The smoke from the summer palace joined the smoke from countless opium pipes, both symbols of China's century of humiliation. While armies fought and palaces burned, other voices were speaking against the opium trade. Christian missionaries working in China saw addiction's devastating effects firsthand. They established hospitals and clinics where they treated the sick, including many opium addicts. They witnessed families destroyed and lives wasted. Many missionaries began writing letters back to Britain and America, describing the moral horror of the opium trade. These missionaries faced a difficult position. They were in China partly because British military power had forced China to accept foreign presence. The same treaties that protected opium merchants also protected missionaries. Yet many missionaries genuinely cared about Chinese people and were horrified by what opium was doing. They wrote articles for church magazines describing addiction's suffering in vivid detail. Some British reformers and politicians also opposed the opium trade on moral grounds. William Gladstone, who would later become Prime Minister, gave speeches in Parliament calling the opium trade shameful and immoral. He argued that Britain was destroying China for profit and that this would bring judgment upon Britain. He was outvoted by those who prioritized commercial interests over moral concerns, but his speeches were recorded and remembered. Chinese officials also continued speaking against opium. They sent memorials to the emperor detailing the crisis. They proposed solutions ranging from strict enforcement to legalization with controlled distribution. Some argued that China should establish its own poppy cultivation to reduce dependence on foreign imports. Others insisted on total prohibition, regardless of the difficulty of enforcement. These debates happened in government offices, while the addiction continued spreading in the streets below. Within Chinese society, families struggled with the problem privately. A wife might watch her husband waste away, becoming thin and pale, losing his job, selling their possessions. She might beg him to stop, threaten to leave, or pray to ancestors for help. But addiction is a powerful force. Many families simply endured the suffering in silence, considering it a shameful secret not to be discussed with outsiders. Some addicts did try to quit. The withdrawal symptoms were terrible severe pain, uncontrollable shaking, vomiting, diarrhea, anxiety so intense it felt like dying. Most who tried to quit alone would fail within days, the suffering too intense to bear without help. A few succeeded through extraordinary willpower or with family support. Some turned to Chinese traditional medicine, seeking herbs that might ease withdrawal symptoms. But for every person who successfully quit, hundreds more remained trapped in addiction's grip. The voices rising against the trade were real and passionate, but they were overwhelmed by commercial forces and government policies that had normalized the opium. trade as simply another aspect of international commerce. Trying to count the victims of the opium trade is difficult because many records were never kept or were destroyed. But historians who have studied this period estimate that by the late 19th century, millions of Chinese people were addicted to opium. Some estimates suggest that perhaps 10% of the adult male population and a smaller percentage of women were regular users. In a country with hundreds of millions of people, even 10% represents staggering numbers. Each addicted person was not just a statistic, but a human being with a story. A farmer who had once grown rice might now neglect his fields while smoking opium all day. His wife would have to work harder to feed their children. The children might grow up malnourished and uneducated because there was no money for school. When the farmer eventually died, perhaps from disease, perhaps from an overdose, perhaps simply from the slow deterioration addiction causes, his family would be left in poverty. Multiply this story by millions, and you begin to grasp the scale of the tragedy. Entire communities were affected. Villages that had been productive for centuries declined into poverty. City neighborhoods became places of despair, where gaunt figures shuffled between opium houses and pawn shops. The social fabric that held Chinese civilization together, family loyalty, community responsibility, respect for tradition, began fraying under the weight of so much addiction. The economic cost was equally devastating. China was already a large but relatively poor country. The Qing Dynasty's government was inefficient and corrupt. Adding a massive drug epidemic on top of these existing problems pushed Chinese society toward crisis. Silver drained out of the country to pay for opium, silver that could have built roads, improved irrigation, or supported schools. Instead, it went to British and other foreign merchants who shipped it back to their home countries. Some Chinese people made fortunes helping distribute opium. These collaborators were despised by other Chinese, but were protected by treaty provisions that made it difficult to prosecute them. They lived well, while their neighbors suffered, a source of bitterness and resentment that added to the general social decay. The presence of wealthy Chinese opium distributors made it harder to portray the problem as simply foreign aggression. It was also a story of how some people will profit from any situation, regardless of the harm caused to their own community. The lost souls, the millions who fell into addiction during the 19th century, were not weak or foolish people. They were ordinary humans who encountered a powerfully addictive substance in a society without understanding of addiction or effective treatment. They deserve to be remembered not as moral failures, but as victims of commercial greed and government policies that prioritized profit over human welfare. Their suffering was real, their numbers were vast, and their memory should remind us that drug policies have consequences that echo through generations. As the 19th century progressed, Western scientists began to understand what opium really was and how it affected the human body. For thousands of years, people had known opium had powerful effects, but did not understand why. That changed when a young German pharmacist named Friedrich Sertiner isolated the primary active X compound from opium in the early 1800s. He called this pure substance morphine, after Morpheus, the Greek god of dreams. Morphine was far more potent than raw opium. A tiny amount could eliminate severe pain. It could also create powerful addiction much faster than smoking opium. Sertiner tested morphine on himself and some friends. He found that while it was an excellent painkiller, it also produced unpleasant effects when the dose was too high, including confusion, nausea, and terrifying dreams. He published his findings, and soon morphine was being used in medicine throughout Europe. The discovery of morphine led to understanding addiction at a chemical level. Scientists realized that opium and morphine somehow changed the brain's function. They observed that people who used these substances regularly needed increasing amounts to achieve the same effect. They documented the painful withdrawal symptoms that occurred when regular use stopped suddenly. This was the beginning of addiction science. Researchers began experimenting with opium's chemistry. They isolated other compounds from the poppy sap, each with different properties. One of these was codeine, a milder compound that was less addictive than morphine, but still useful for treating pain and coughs. Another was thebaine, which was toxic on its own, but could be chemically modified into other useful drugs. The simple poppy sap was revealed to be a complex mixture of many different molecules. Then, in the late 1800s, chemists found ways to modify morphine's structure. They added chemical groups to the morphine molecule, creating new substances. One of these modifications produced a compound that seemed to be an even better painkiller than morphine. A German pharmaceutical company began selling it under the brand name heroin. They marketed it as a non-addictive substitute for morphine, a cure for morphine addiction, and a treatment for coughs. These claims proved tragically wrong. Heroin was even more addictive than morphine. Understanding the chemistry helped scientists realize why addiction was so powerful. Opium compounds bind to specific receptors in the brain. Receptors that normally respond to the body's own natural pain-relieving chemicals. When someone uses opium or morphine regularly, the brain reduces its production of natural pain relievers and becomes dependent on the external drug. Stopping suddenly leaves the brain without either its own chemicals or the external drug, causing the severe symptoms of withdrawal. This knowledge made clear that addiction was not a moral failing, but a biological trap that could catch anyone who used these substances repeatedly. By the early 20th century, the international community was beginning to recognize that opium was a global problem requiring global solutions. The opium trade had spread beyond China. Other Asian countries had their own struggles with addiction. Even Western countries were seeing increasing problems with morphine and heroin addiction. The idea emerged that nations should cooperate to control dangerous drugs rather than compete to profit from them. In 1909, representatives from 13 nations gathered in Shanghai, China, for the International Opium Commission. This was the first international meeting focused on drug control. The United States, which had its own opium problems due to Chinese immigration bringing the habit to America, led the call for international action. The meeting was not empowered to create binding laws, but it represented an important shift in thinking. Drug control was becoming an international concern. The Shanghai meeting was followed by conferences in The Hague in 1911 and 1912, where more concrete agreements were reached. Nations agreed to enact laws controlling the production and distribution of opium, morphine, and cocaine. These early treaties were limited and difficult to enforce, but they established the principle that nations had a responsibility to prevent drug trafficking. The agreements focused primarily on controlling legal trade, as participating nations understood that completely eliminating illegal trade would be much more difficult. China, meanwhile, was attempting to address its internal crisis. After the fall of the Qing Dynasty in 1911 and the establishment of a republic, Chinese leaders made eliminating opium addiction a national priority. They launched education campaigns explaining addiction's dangers. They established treatment centers to help addicts recover. They severely punished opium dealers, sometimes with death. These efforts had mixed success. The addiction problem was so massive that solving it would take decades. The international agreements were hampered by the fact that some nations still profited from opium. Britain continued to control India's poppy fields. France had opium monopolies in its Asian colonies. These colonial powers talked about controlling opium while ensuring their own commercial interests were protected. The hypocrisy was obvious but difficult to challenge because these same powerful nations controlled the international forums where drug policy was discussed. World War I interrupted international cooperation on drug control. But after the war, the League of Nations took up the issue. The League established a permanent committee to monitor drug trade and help nations enforce their laws. This committee collected statistics, published reports, and tried to pressure nations to take drug control seriously. Progress was slow, but the global consensus was gradually shifting. Nations were beginning to accept that the opium trade had been a mistake, a dark chapter in history that should not be repeated. The question was whether this recognition had come in time to help the millions already trapped in addiction's grip. China's campaign to eliminate opium addiction continued through the early 20th century with varying intensity. Different Chinese governments, as they rose and fell during this chaotic period, took different approaches. Some focused on treatment and education. Others emphasized harsh punishment for dealers and users. Some tried to control and tax opium to fund government operations, while gradually reducing its availability. None of these approaches worked perfectly, but slowly, gradually, the problem began to improve. The critical turning point came after 1949, when the Communist Party established the People's Republic of China. The new government viewed opium addiction as a symbol of China's century of humiliation and was absolutely determined to eliminate it. They launched a comprehensive campaign that combined treatment, punishment, and social pressure. Addicts were required to register and enter treatment programs. Dealers faced execution. Growing poppies became a serious crime. The treatment programs were often harsh by modern standards. Addicts were essentially forced to quit cold turkey, to stop using abruptly, and endure the painful withdrawal symptoms without medication to ease the suffering. They were organized into groups where they supported each other and also monitored each other to prevent backsliding. Community pressure reinforced the program, with neighbors expected to report any opium use they observed. The approach was not gentle, but it was effective. Enforcement was equally severe. Opium dealers were tried publicly and, if convicted, often executed publicly as well. These executions were meant to terrify anyone who might consider entering the drug trade. The message was clear: the new China would not tolerate what the old China had endured. Farmers who grew poppies had their fields burned and faced punishment ranging from fines to prison. The government did not distinguish between small growers and major traffickers. Opium production was criminalized. Within about 10 years, China had dramatically reduced its addiction problem. By the 1960s, opium addiction in China had dropped from affecting millions to affecting thousands. This was a remarkable achievement given the scale of the problem decades earlier. The cost in terms of individual freedom and the harshness of treatment was high, but the result was that a generation of Chinese people grew up without the shadow of opium hanging over their communities. However, the legacy of the Opium Century continued to shape Chinese attitudes. The memory of foreign powers forcing opium on China remained a source of national bitterness. Chinese education emphasized this history as an example of foreign imperialism's cruelty. The phrase "century of humiliation" became standard language for describing the period from the Opium Wars to the establishment of the People's Republic. The wounds had healed on the surface, but scars remained beneath. Scars that still influence Chinese perspectives on foreign relations and national sovereignty today. The Opium Wars and the opium trade that caused them profoundly shaped modern history. The conflicts forced China to open its economy and society to foreign influence, ending centuries of relative isolation. The unequal treaties that followed the wars gave foreign powers control over Chinese ports and cities, creating semi-colonial conditions that would last until the mid-20th century. Chinese nationalism grew partly as a response to these humiliations, eventually contributing to revolutionary movements that overthrew the Qing Dynasty and later established communist rule. British wealth during the Victorian era was partly built on the opium trade. The profits from selling opium to China flowed back to Britain, funding investments in industry, infrastructure, and empire building. While historians debate how much of Britain's prosperity came specifically from opium versus other colonial enterprises, there is no doubt that the drug trade was significant. Wealthy British families built fortunes that persist to this day on money that included opium profits, though this connection is rarely mentioned in polite society. Hong Kong's unique history directly resulted from the First Opium War. The island Britain took as a treaty port became one of Asia's most important financial centers. For over 150 years, Hong Kong existed as a British colonia, small piece of Britain on China's coast. When Britain finally returned Hong Kong to China in 1997, the handover was emotionally complex, involving memories of the war that had transferred the territory in the first place. Today, as tensions between Hong Kong residents who value Western-style freedoms and Beijing's desire for control trace back to that original transfer following the Opium War. The wars also demonstrated the gap between Western and Asian military technology in the 19th century. China's defeats shocked other Asian nations into realizing they needed to modernize rapidly or face similar humiliation. Japan, in particular, observed China's defeats carefully and launched aggressive modernization efforts. Within decades, Japan had transformed itself into a military power capable of defeating both China and Russia in wars. The ripples from the Opium Wars spread across all of Asia. On the global stage, the Opium Wars represented an early example of drug trade's geopolitical power. Today, drug trafficking continues to influence international relations, fund terrorist groups, corrupt governments, and cause violence in many countries. Afghanistan produces most of the world's opium, and the profits from that trade have funded conflicts there for decades. Mexico faces violence from drug cartels that make billions smuggling cocaine, heroin, and other drugs to the United States. The fundamental pattern established in the 19th century that drug trade creates enormous profits and enormous problems continues worldwide. The opium trade's legacy also includes understanding of colonialism's moral complexity. European powers often justified colonialism by claiming they were bringing civilization, Christianity, and commerce to backward peoples. The Opium Wars revealed the darkness beneath these noble claims. Britain, the world's most powerful nation, fought wars specifically to maintain the right to sell addictive drugs to another country. This fact undermines any simple narrative about Western colonialism being purely beneficial or civilizing. The past casts long shadows, and the shadow of the opium trade still darkens historical understanding. In the 21st century, the world faces an opioid crisis with eerie parallels to the 19th century's opium epidemic in China. Pharmaceutical companies developed powerful opioid painkillers medications derived from or similar to the compounds in opium poppies. They marketed these drugs aggressively, downplaying addiction risks. Doctors prescribed them liberally, trusting the pharmaceutical companies' assurances. Millions of people took the medications as directed and became addicted. In the United States, opioid addiction has killed hundreds of thousands of people over the past 2 decades. The epidemic began with prescription drugs like OxyContin. When authorities made prescriptions harder to obtain, addicted people often turned to heroin or synthetic opioids like fentanyl. These illegal drugs are even more dangerous because their purity and strength vary unpredictably. Users die from overdoses, never knowing exactly how powerful the dose they are taking will be. The modern crisis mirrors the historical one in troubling ways. Then, British companies and merchants prioritized profit over Chinese welfare. Now, pharmaceutical companies prioritized profit over patient welfare. Then, addiction destroyed families and communities across China. Now, addiction destroys families and communities across America and other countries. Then, Chinese officials struggled to control the influx of drugs from outside. Now, American officials struggle to control drugs flowing across borders or being prescribed by doctors. The historical parallel has not been lost on Chinese observers. Some Chinese commentators have noted with irony that America now faces an opioid epidemic, while China, through harsh measures decades ago, largely eliminated its problem. They sometimes frame this as historical karma. The West introduced opium addiction to China, and now Western countries suffer similar plagues. This perspective oversimplifies complex situations but reflects how historical memory influences contemporary attitudes. The modern crisis has also revealed how difficult addiction problems are to solve. America has tried education campaigns, tighter prescription controls, increased treatment availability, and harsher penalties for dealers. Progress has been modest. Addiction rates remain high, and deaths continue mounting. The solutions that worked for China, mandatory treatment, severe punishment, strong social pressure, seem unacceptable in societies that prioritize individual freedom and limit government power. Finding approaches that effectively reduce addiction while respecting civil liberties remains an unsolved challenge. The poppies, children, morphine, heroin, oxycodone, fentanyl, and other opioid drugs continue causing suffering worldwide. From the ancient Mesopotamian farmer who first noticed the poppy's power to modern patients who become addicted to prescribed painkillers, humanity has struggled to benefit from opium's medical properties without falling into addiction's trap. We have learned much about the chemistry of addiction, the biology of the brain, and the social factors that influence drug use. But we have not yet found a complete solution to the problem that a simple flower first created thousands of years ago. The Opium Wars teach us several lessons that remain relevant today. First, They demonstrate that economic interests often override moral concerns in international relations. British leaders knew the opium trade was causing massive harm, yet they chose to protect it because it was profitable. This pattern repeats throughout history. Nations and corporations pursue profit even when doing so causes suffering, and only stop when forced by law or public pressure to change course. Second, the wars illustrate how technological superiority can be misused. Britain's advanced ships and weapons gave it overwhelming power, which it used not to protect the weak or advance justice, but to force an unwilling nation to accept an addictive drug. Power without moral restraint becomes oppression. The same lesson applies today in contexts ranging from military intervention to economic dominance to technological control. Third, the opium story shows the importance of sovereignty and self-determination. China tried to protect its people by banning a harmful substance, a decision that should have been respected as the legitimate choice of a sovereign nation. Instead, that decision was overridden by foreign military force. The resentment this created lasted generations and shaped Chinese attitudes toward the West. When powerful nations ignore weaker nations' rights, they create lasting bitterness that can poison relations for decades or centuries. Fourth, the crisis demonstrates addiction's devastating social cost. Addiction is not just an individual problem, but a social catastrophe. When it affects enough people, it destroys families, reduces productivity, drains wealth, and corrupts institutions. Any society facing addiction on a large scale will suffer profoundly in ways that affect everyone, not just users. Prevention and treatment should be priorities for any government because the cost of inaction is so high. Fifth, the opium trade illustrates how difficult it is to undo harm once done. China struggled for a century to overcome opium addiction after foreign merchants introduced it widely. Even with determined government action, the problem took decades to solve. This suggests that prevention is far preferable to cure. It is better to stop harmful practices before they become entrenched than to try to eliminate them after millions are already affected. Sixth, the story highlights how commerce and empire intertwine. The British East India Company operated as both business and government, blurring lines between profit and policy. This created conflicts of interest, where commercial considerations influenced diplomatic and military decisions. Today's debates about corporate influence on government policy echo these same concerns. When private interests control public policy, the public good often suffers. Finally, the opium century reminds us that historical injustices shape present relationships. Chinese people remember the Opium Wars as examples of Western cruelty and arrogance. These memories influence how China approaches foreign relations today. Understanding this history is essential for anyone trying to understand modern Chinese nationalism, sovereignty concerns, or attitudes toward international law. The past is never truly past. It lives in memory and continues affecting how nations and peoples view each other and interact across borders and cultures. Maps can tell stories that words alone cannot fully capture. Imagine a map of the Indian subcontinent in the mid-1800s. In regions like Bengal and Bihar, vast areas would be colored to show poppy cultivation. These were not small gardens, but enormous agricultural zones where hundreds of thousands of farmers grew nothing but opium poppies under British East India Company control. The map would show how Britain had transformed Indian agriculture to serve the drug trade. Now follow the sea routes from India to China. Ships left ports like Calcutta and Bombay, laden with chests of opium. They sailed across the Indian Ocean, through the Strait of Malacca, and up the South China Sea to reach Chinese ports. The map would show these shipping lanes as thick lines representing countless voyages over decades. Each line represents not just commercial traffic, but the physical movement of addiction from one continent to another. In China, the map would mark the treaty ports established after the wars. Canton, Shanghai, Ningbo, Fuzhou, and Xiamen became openings through which foreign goods, particularly opium, flowed into China. From these ports, distribution networks spread inland along rivers and roads. The map would show the opium moving like a stain spreading across fabric, reaching deeper into Chinese territory each year. Cities far from the coast eventually had their own addiction problems as the internal distribution network expanded. The map would also show the locations of major battles during the Opium Wars. Most fighting occurred along the coast or near rivers because British warships needed water deep enough for navigation. The map reveals Britain's strategy control the coast and major waterways to pressure the interior. Chinese forces tried to defend these points but were overwhelmed by superior firepower and mobility. Each battle site represents not just military action, but a point where Chinese sovereignty was challenged and defeated. Hong Kong Island appears on the map as a tiny speck off the coast of Guangdong Province. Its small size makes clear how disproportionate the territorial loss was to China. Tiny Rocky Island became a British colony for over 150 years, but the island's location was strategic, positioned perfectly to control southern trade routes. The map shows why Britain wanted it and why losing it stung China beyond the mere size of the territory. Modern maps of global drug trade routes show that opium poppies are now cultivated primarily in Afghanistan, with smaller production in Myanmar and Mexico. The trade routes have shifted, but the basic geography of drug trafficking remains. Similar drugs flow from poor producer countries to wealthier consumer countries. A world map of opioid overdose deaths would show concentration in North America and parts of Europe, revealing how today's crisis differs geographically from the 19th century's Chinese epidemic. The maps of past and present, when viewed together, show how the poppy's geography has shifted, but its human cost has remained tragically constant across time and place. A single flower, small enough to cup in your hand, changed the course of world history. The opium poppy was not deliberately bred to be a tool of empire or a weapon of war. It simply existed, one plant among millions, with properties that humans discovered and then chose to exploit. The poppy itself was neutral, neither good nor evil, neither benevolent nor malicious. It was human decisions that determined how the flower's power would be used. Think about all the choices that led to the opium crisis. Ancient farmers could have destroyed the poppies as weeds, but they chose to cultivate them for medicine. That choice was reasonable and beneficial. Later merchants could have traded opium only for legitimate medical use, but they chose to expand sales to anyone willing to pay, medical need or not. That choice prioritized profit over welfare. Still later, the British government could have restricted the opium trade when evidence of harm emerged, but they chose to protect commercial interests. That choice valued money over justice. Each decision seemed small at the time, Each person making those decisions probably felt justified by the circumstances and values of their era. The farmers needed medicine for pain. The merchants sought profit, which was considered virtuous in commercial societies. The government officials wanted to maintain Britain's economic power and protect their citizens' investments. None of them likely imagined they were contributing to a tragedy that would affect millions of people across multiple generations. This is how large historical forces emerge from accumulated small choices. No single person decided to addict millions of Chinese people to opium. That outcome emerged from thousands of individual decisions by farmers, merchants, officials, and users, each making what seemed like a reasonable choice in their immediate context. The lesson is both humbling and important. Our small choices accumulate into large consequences, and we should consider not just immediate effects, but long-term impacts. The opium poppy still grows today. It blooms in fields in Afghanistan, Myanmar, and Mexico. Pharmaceutical companies cultivate it legally to produce medical morphine and codeine. The same flower that caused so much suffering also relieves tremendous pain for surgery patients, cancer patients, and others facing severe physical agony. The poppy's dual nature, healer and destroyer, reminds us that few things in life are purely good or purely evil. Context, intention, and control determine whether something helpful becomes harmful. What has changed since the 19th century is not human nature, but institutions and knowledge. We understand addiction better now. We have international laws restricting drug trade. We have treaties and organizations devoted to controlling dangerous substances. These systems are imperfect and often ineffective, but they exist, which is progress compared to an era when powerful nations could wage war to force other nations to accept addictive drugs. The poppy remains, still blooming in its quiet way. But humanity has slowly, painfully developed better ways to manage its power. Take a deep breath and let this story settle into your thoughts like dust finding rest. The tale of the opium poppy spans thousands of years and touches every continent. It connects ancient Mesopotamian farmers to modern patients in hospital beds. It links British merchants to Chinese families. It shows us that history is not just about kings and battles, but about choices, about what we value, how we treat others, and whether we prioritize human dignity over profit. If this story moved you, share it with someone who might find meaning in it. These lessons from history should not remain hidden in dusty books, but should inform how we think about modern challenges. When you hear about opioid addiction today, remember China's century of suffering. When you consider questions of sovereignty and power, recall how Britain forced its will on a weaker nation. When you think about the long-term consequences of short-term decisions, picture those vast poppy fields in India and the opium dens in China that followed. History teaches us, but only if we listen. The story of opium warns us that human suffering can become someone else's profit unless we remain vigilant. It reminds us that power must be tempered with morality, that sovereignty deserves respect, and that what seems acceptable in one era may be judged harshly by later generations. These lessons remain relevant as we face modern challenges involving addiction, international trade, and the balance between freedom and regulation. As you prepare to rest, consider one final thought. The small poppy flower with its paper-thin petals became more powerful than armies, not because of any magic it possessed, but because of how humans chose to use it. We cannot blame the flower for the suffering that followed. We can only understand that human choices, what we cultivate, what we trade, what we allow, what we forbid, shape the world in ways both obvious and subtle. The opium century ended, but its echoes continue. The treaties signed under duress still influence how nations view sovereignty and international law. The wealth accumulated through the drug trade still exists in family fortunes and national treasures. The addiction patterns established then reappear today in new forms. History does not repeat exactly, but it rhymes. And the rhythm of the opium story can be heard in modern crises if we listen carefully. Perhaps the deepest truth the opium story offers is this: humans are capable of both tremendous compassion and terrible cruelty, often in the same moment, within the same culture, sometimes within the same person. The missionaries who opposed the trade and the merchants who profited from it were often from the same nation, educated in the same schools, believing in the same God. Understanding this complexity helps us recognize similar contradictions in our own time and our own hearts. Close your eyes now. Let the story drift away like smoke dissolving in air. Remember that you are connected to this history, whether you knew it before tonight or not. We all inherit the world shaped by past choices and carry the responsibility to make better ones. Sleep peacefully, and when you wake, you will carry with you the knowledge of one small flower that changed everything. What will you do with what you know? That question remains open, waiting for your answer in the morning light. Sweet dreams, and may history's lessons guide you toward wisdom and compassion in all your choices.